Right now, as you listen to this, you are wielding a weapon forged over 1,000 years ago. Seriously.
You really are.
Every single time you casually throw around words like sky or anger or knife or window, or even every time you just use the pronouns they or them, you are deploying the literal linguistic ghosts of the Viking Age.
Yeah, you're speaking a fused language, really, born out of a collision that completely rewired the globe.
Exactly. And that hidden legacy, the stuff hiding right in our own mouths, right in our DNA, that is exactly what we are here to finally crack open today.
It is the perfect place to start because, well, we have arrived at the absolute grand finale. I mean, 27 previous deep dives, 3 centuries of history, and now, session 28.
It's just surreal to be here. We really want to welcome you, the listener, to the close of this massive journey. We've asked you to travel a huge road with us, and honestly, the sheer scale of what you've experienced across these sessions it's staggering.
It really is.
I mean, we've climbed the immense cosmic trunk of the world tree, Yggdrasil. We've stood shoulder to shoulder in the shield wall with Ragnar and his sons.
Yeah, and we navigated those incredibly tense political back channels with Rollo and Francier.
We watched Floki bend oak into masterpieces, and we braced ourselves against the freezing, terrifying unknown of the open Atlantic with Eric the Red.
We even stood with Leif Erikson on the virgin shores of a completely new world, and then, we watched King Alfred rise from the muddy, desperate swamps of Wessex to lay the very foundation for England.
You've been here for every mile. Thank you.
I completely agree. The dedication to stick with a story this complex, this sprawling, is just amazing. But today, the mission completely changes.
Right.
We're done mapping out the biographies of individual kings. We aren't going to dissect the flanking maneuvers of any more shield walls.
Yeah.
Today is the ultimate reckoning. We are finally going to answer the massive, heavy questions that have hummed quietly beneath the surface of all 3 centuries of this history.
Okay, let's unpack this one last time. I want you to think of this entire 28-part series like an immense, incredibly intricate tapestry, or like a pointillist painting.
I like that analogy.
Right. Because for weeks, we've been standing 2 inches away from the canvas. We've been obsessively studying the individual dots, the specific raids, the keel designs, the treaties, the individual blood feuds. But today, we take 10 big steps back.
We finally look at the masterpiece in its entirety.
Exactly. What did they actually leave behind? Why do they still grip our modern imagination so fiercely? Who really won? But I think the very first thing that jumps out when you step back from this tapestry is the fundamental paradox. The great question, were the Vikings heroes or were they monsters?
And if we're being intellectually honest, we have to start with the monster.
Yeah, we do.
We cannot launder the blood out of this history just because we happen to like the aesthetics of their ships or the poetry of their sagas. The case for the monster isn't just real, it's devastating. You really have to put yourself in the shoes of a monk at Lindisfarne in 793, or a farmer in coastal Ireland.
It's pure nightmare fuel.
It is. These were raiders who descended completely without warning from the sea. They targeted peaceful, fundamentally undefended communities. I mean, we are talking about the mass murder of unarmed clerics, the burning of ancient libraries, the wholesale plundering of generational wealth.
Let me jump in there, though, because a cynical modern listener might say, well, wasn't the early medieval period just universally brutal? Like Charlemagne was cutting off heads in Saxony, everyone was fighting. Were the Vikings uniquely monstrous or just, better at it?
That's a crucial distinction, and the answer is that the mechanism of their violence was uniquely terrifying.
Right.
Land-based warfare back then, like Charlemagne's campaigns, it moved at the speed of a marching army. You had weeks of warning. You could flee, you could negotiate, you could gather a defense. The Vikings weaponized the sea.
Yes, the clinker-built longship.
Exactly. It allowed them to traverse deep oceans and then row up incredibly shallow rivers. They could appear in the center of your kingdom, strike with overwhelming localized force, and vanish back into the water before a regional king even knew they were there. That asymmetry, that lack of warning, that is the definition of terror. It was a completely new paradigm of violence.
Right, it's the psychological warfare aspect.
Right.
Like the siege of Paris, where they mass-hanged prisoners in full view of the city walls. That wasn't just killing. That was a calculated theater of cruelty designed to break the psychological will of the defenders.
Precisely. And we haven't even touched on the darkest engine of their expansion, which was the slave trade.
Yeah, that's a heavy one.
It wasn't just an unfortunate byproduct of their raiding. It was a massive, indispensable pillar of their entire economy. The trade in human beings funded the Viking Age. They systematically captured tens of thousands of people, Irish, Slavs, Anglo-Saxons, Franks,
Ripped them from their homes.
chained them and funneled them through vast, brutal logistical networks stretching from Dublin down the Volga River all the way to the massive slave markets of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad.
It's staggering.
The sheer volume of human suffering generated by that system is practically unimaginable. Add to that their religious practices, which demonstrably included ritual human sacrifice, and you just have to sit with a very dark reality. To the people they preyed upon, they were not glorious adventurers, they were nightmares made flesh.
The monster under the bed, except it literally kicked the door in. But here is the pivot. We have to look at the exact same people from the other side of the ledger, because the case for the creator, the builder, the visionary, it is just as robust. And I think that is what makes them so infinitely fascinating. Let's talk about the ships for a second. We just called them weapons of terror, but functionally, from an engineering standpoint, they were miracles.
Oh, absolutely.
The technological genius required to build a clinker-built longship, where the oak planks overlap and are riveted together so the hull actually flexes and undulates with the ocean waves instead of snapping. That was centuries ahead of its time.
It's the aerospace engineering of the 9th century.
Exactly. And they didn't just use those ships to steal chalices. They used them to cross the treacherous, freezing, open Atlantic Ocean. They reached North America 500 years before Columbus. They did it in open wooden boats with zero modern navigation. The sheer, unfathomable courage that takes is wild. And beyond exploration, look at the economic infrastructure they laid down. They were the ultimate state founders and city builders.
That's the part that often gets overshadowed by the axes and the raiding. They didn't just burn cities down, they planted the seeds for modern metropolises. When they arrived in Ireland, Ireland was largely a rural agrarian society clustered around monasteries. The Vikings founded Dublin, Cork, Waterford, Limerick. They integrated Ireland into a global trading network. In England, they took Jorvik, modern York, and turned it from a declining post-Roman settlement into a booming cosmopolitan economic powerhouse.
And as you mentioned earlier, their statecraft was incredible. I mean, Rollo's descendants created the Duchy of Normandy, which became the most powerful political entity in Western Europe.
Yeah, and look east.
Right, the Viking Russ. Navigating the river systems of Eastern Europe, they laid the structural foundations for what would become the massive states of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine.
And then there's Iceland.
Oh, Iceland is the best example. You have this barren, violently active volcanic rock in the middle of the North Atlantic. They don't just survive there. They create a sublime, artistic, and legal culture. They established the Althing, one of the oldest continuing parliaments on Earth, building a kingless commonwealth based on incredibly complex legal codes. And they write the sagas, literature that honestly rivals the Greeks or Shakespeare for its psychological depth.
What's fascinating here is, and what really challenges us as historians, is how we're supposed to synthesize these two extremes, because the human brain really struggles with this. The hardest reality to grasp is that the man who kicked down the door of a monastery, murdered a monk, and chained up a captive was frequently the exact same individual who went home, gently cared for his children, wrote delicate, heartbreaking poetry about the changing of the seasons, and acted as a meticulous, fair-minded judge at his local assembly.
It breaks your brain a little bit. And I think that's where we run into a major roadblock with how we consume history today. We are so conditioned by modern storytelling. We go to the movies, we watch these massive comic book franchises, and we are trained to expect a clear villain. We want Thanos.
Right, we want the evil empire.
Exactly. We want the universe neatly sorted into good guys and bad guys so we know exactly who to root for. The Viking Age refuses to give us that comfort. It demands we accept a terrifying cognitive dissonance, but the capacity for magnificent transcendent creation and horrific stomach-turning cruelty exists side by side, not just in the same culture, but in the exact same human heart.
It's the ultimate test of historical empathy, and I want to be clear here, empathy does not mean sympathy.
No, definitely not.
We don't excuse the atrocities. Empathy means doing the hard work of truly understanding how a human being could be all of those contradictory things simultaneously. When we look at the Vikings, we aren't looking at aliens. We are looking in a mirror at the absolute, terrifying, full spectrum of human capability.
That is perfectly said. Now, speaking of how we view them, before we start actually tallying up the geopolitical and cultural inheritance they left us, we need to do some serious house cleaning.
Oh, yes. The myth busting.
We have to bust some myths, because the doorway that 99% of people walk through to find the Vikings is built on pop culture. And while some of it is great, a lot of it is just dead wrong. So I'm going to take deep, deep pleasure in enthusiastically dismantling the most famous visual myth in human history, the horned helmet.
It never dies, no matter how many times historians try to kill it.
It survives like a cockroach.
Ah.
Listen to me carefully. Vikings did not wear horned helmets into battle, ever. Zero historical evidence, zero archaeological evidence.
Right.
Let's just think about the mechanics of Viking warfare for a second. You are standing in a tight shield wall. You are packed shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield with your brothers, pushing against an enemy line. The absolute last thing you want on your head are two giant, prominent handles.
It's a literal liability.
A massive one. An enemy could grab the horn and snap your neck. A glancing sword blow that would normally slide off a smooth, domed iron helmet would catch on the horn and crush your skull. Or, you just accidentally poke your best friend in the eye every time you turned your head in the shield wall. It is catastrophically impractical.
So where does it come from?
The horned helmet is an invention of the 19th century. Specifically, it was popularized by a costume designer named Carl Emil Dupler for Richard Wagner's romantic opera, The Ring Cycle, in 1876. It is brilliant theatrical branding, but it is purely operatic fiction.
And right alongside the visual of the horned helmet is the behavioral myth, the dirty barbarian trope. The idea that they were these filthy, mud-caked savages who never washed. We touched on this during our deep dive into the Jorvik excavations, but the reality is the exact opposite.
They were the hygiene influencers of the early Middle Ages.
They absolutely were. The archaeological record is overflowing with grooming tools, beautifully carved bone combs, tweezers, ear spoons, nail cleaners. They bathed at least once a week, which, by the way, Saturday in Scandinavian languages is literally still called washing day, which was a remarkably high standard for 9th century Europe. There is a famous and honestly hilarious account from an English chronicler named John of Wallingford.
Oh, I love this quote.
He bitterly complained that the Vikings were actually too clean. He lamented that because they combed their hair every day, bathed every Saturday, and frequently changed their clothes, they were unfairly seducing the local English women and stealing them away from the comparatively filthy Englishmen.
I love that so much. It just completely shatters the Hollywood mud filter we put on the past. But I know there is a myth we need to address that isn't funny at all. It's much heavier, and frankly, it is actively dangerous in the modern world.
Yes. We absolutely have to confront the modern distortion of Viking history by hateful, racist ideologies. Over the last century, stretching from the Nazis in the 1930s right up to modern white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups today, there has been a concerted effort to hijack Norse symbols. They take the runes, the imagery of Odin and Thor, the concept of Valhalla, and they twist them to create a fantasy of a pure white warrior past. They project this myth of an isolated, racially pure, hyper-masculine brotherhood of the North.
And we need to dismantle that, not just with moral outrage, but with hard empirical historical fact.
Precisely. Because the real Vikings, the people who actually lived and died in the 9th and 10th centuries, were the exact opposite of isolated or pure. To call them symbols of racial purity is a fundamental, laughable misreading of who they were. They were, without exaggeration, the ultimate cosmopolitans of the early medieval world.
Let's look at the mechanics of their society. They were a maritime trading culture. You cannot be a successful maritime trader and remain isolated. It's an oxymoron.
Exactly. When we look at isotopic analysis of the teeth found in Viking graves, or when we look at large-scale modern DNA studies of Viking burial sites across Europe, the results are incredibly diverse. They traveled further, traded wider, and mixed more than almost anyone else alive at the time.
Right.
They routinely intermarried and blended with the Franks, the Slavic populations of Eastern Europe, the Celtic Irish, the Anglo-Saxons, the indigenous Sami people of the far north. They had deep, continuous trade contacts with the Abbasid Caliphate, bringing back millions of silver dirhams, Persian silk, and Indian spices.
Yeah.
Look at a place like Birka in Sweden or Hedeby in Denmark. You would hear dozens of languages spoken in the markets. You would see clothing styles adopted from Byzantium and the Middle East. Their entire genetic, linguistic, and cultural reality is defined by continental connection and constant enthusiastic mixing.
That's the ultimate irony. These modern hate groups are idolizing a culture that would have looked at their obsession with isolation and purity and thought they were completely insane. The Vikings didn't build walls to keep people out. They built ships to go see who was out there, to trade with them, to learn their tech, and to bring them home.
They were the great connectors.
They really were. Now, acknowledging how modern audiences find this history, we have to talk about the massive pop culture elephant in the room, the doorway that brought millions of people into this world. I'm talking about the Netflix shows, Vikings, and the sequel series, Vikings. Valhalla.
Right. And as historians, we could easily sit here and play the pedantic game. We could point out how they compress decades of history into a single season, or how they have characters interacting who historically lived 50 years apart.
We could, but we aren't going to. Because we actually owe those shows a massive debt of gratitude. They have done a tremendous service to the public understanding of history. Even with the dramatic liberties and the compressed timelines, they brought the Norse world, its textures, its tensions, its humanity, to a massive global audience. At their best, those shows captured the exact same truth we've been trying to build toward for 28 episodes.
They did something crucial. They shifted the perspective. For centuries, Western history treated the Vikings merely as a natural disaster that happened to the English or the French, a hurricane of axes. The shows framed them as the complex protagonists of their own incredibly rich story. They showed the deep sincerity of their pagan faith. They showed the intricate, deadly politics of the Kattegat. They showed the grief, the complicated family dynamics, the role of women in their society.
They showed that they were fully human. And if you were listening to this right now and it was watching Ragnar Lothbrok sitting on a hill wondering what was across the sea, or seeing Lagertha fight, or watching Harald Hardrada navigate the courts of Europe that sparked your curiosity, well, if those shows brought you to this deep dive series, then they did their job flawlessly. They opened the door. Our job here has simply been to take your hand and walk you further into the truer, even more remarkable reality that inspired the fiction.
The fiction is the hook, and history is the anchor. And once you are solidly anchored in the real history, you can finally step back and look at the Great Tally. We've spent 3 centuries with them. But what did they actually leave behind when the Viking Age officially closed? Let's trace the lines of creation, because the geopolitical legacy of the Vikings is, quite literally, the foundation of modern Europe.
Let's map it out. Start with England. The irony of the Viking invasions of England is that by trying to conquer it, they inadvertently forged it. When the great heathen army arrived, England was a fractured mess of competing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, Wessex. The Vikings crushed almost all of them, leaving only Alfred the Great isolated in the swamps of Wessex. In order to survive and push back, Alfred and his descendants had to completely reorganize society. They built fortified towns called burhs, they created a standing army, and crucially, they created the unified political concept of Engleland. England as a unified nation was forged in the crucible of Viking pressure.
And the geopolitical irony compounds itself, because centuries later, in 1066, that unified England is completely transformed and conquered by the Normans. And who were the Normans? They were the descendants of the Vikings. Which brings us to France. The massive influential region of Normandy wasn't just influenced by Vikings, it was legally founded by the Viking warlord Rollo through the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte. The French king literally gave a Viking an enormous chunk of his country to act as a buffer against other Vikings.
Paying the wolf to guard the sheep?
Exactly. Now swing your view to the east. Look at the vast, complex territories of modern Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. They trace their founding political state, the Kievan Rus, directly back to the Swedish Viking traders and warriors who navigated those immense river systems. The very name Russia is widely believed by linguists and historians to derive from the rowing men of the north. They were the logistical glue that held that early empire together.
Then you look west to Ireland. As we mentioned, they fundamentally altered the trajectory of Irish civilization by shifting it from a purely agrarian, monastic society to an urbanized, commercially connected one through the founding of the major coastal cities, and of course, Iceland. An entirely new society with its own unique laws and literature, conjured out of nothing on a volcanic glacier. They literally drew the borders of the modern map.
The geopolitical legacy is massive, but I know you have a favorite legacy that is much more intimate.
Oh, I do. The map is great, but my favorite legacy is the invisible one. It is the one currently sitting right in our mouths. If you speak English today, you're speaking Norse. And I'm not just talking about obscure, archaic nautical terms that only sailors use. I'm talking about the fundamental building blocks of human communication.
The mechanics of how this happened are fascinating. When the Vikings settled in the vast territory of eastern and northern England known as the Danelaw, they didn't just rule as an isolated, aloof elite. They farmed. They lived right next door to the Anglo-Saxons.
Right. And Old English and Old Norse were both Germanic languages, so they were somewhat related. But the grammar and the word endings were entirely different. So imagine a Viking farmer and an Anglo-Saxon farmer leaning over a fence trying to trade a pig for some barley. They need to understand each other. So what happens? Over generations, they strip away the complicated grammatical endings of both languages. They streamline it. They create a sort of linguistic fusion, a pidgin that evolves into Middle English.
It's grammatical leveling driven by pure economic and social necessity.
Exactly. And the Norse gifted the English language some of its most violent, vital, and everyday words. The verbs take, hit, want, die, thrust, guess. Nouns like sky, knife, egg, window, husband, legs, skin, anger. The word law itself is a Norse import. But the most mind-blowing one to linguists is the pronouns. The Norse completely replaced the native Old English plural pronouns. The words they, their, and them are Viking words. For a language to adopt foreign pronouns is incredibly rare. It proves how deeply integrated these two peoples became.
That's a great point.
And of course, the days of the week. Every time you book a meeting on Tuesday for Tyr, Wednesday for Odin, Thursday for Thor, or Friday for Frigg, you are invoking the old gods. Billions of people around the globe use this legacy every single day to form their most intimate thoughts and structure their time, completely unaware that they are speaking the echoes of the Viking Age.
And that profound linguistic legacy is mirrored by an even more intimate biological one. We emphasized earlier that they were the ultimate mixers. They were a diaspora. Well, the mechanical result of that mixing is a profound genetic legacy. Millions upon millions of people alive today across the UK, Ireland, France, Eastern Europe, Russia, and the Americas carry identifiable Viking DNA. When they settled, they didn't remain a segregated caste. They married into the local populations. They didn't just leave standing stones with runes on them. They left themselves. The history we've been studying for 28 weeks is quite literally pulsing through the veins of a significant portion of the modern world.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Beyond the blood and the words, they also left us a physical object that has transcended its original engineering purpose to become a universal, almost mythological metaphor. I'm talking about the longship. The clinker-built longship isn't just a boat anymore. It has become the ultimate human emblem of boldness. It represents this innate, terrifying, beautiful daring to launch yourself into the complete unknown, to look at a terrifying, lethal expanse of ocean and trust your skill, your courage, and the wood beneath your feet enough to cross it.
It's the physical manifestation of humanity's refusal to stay put, the absolute rejection of boundaries.
Yes. Think about how that symbol endures. When NASA, the pinnacle of modern scientific achievement, decided to send a spacecraft to brave the alien lethal environment of Mars in the 1970s, to cross millions of miles of dark space and touch down on another world, what did they name the program? The Viking program. The Viking 1 and Viking 2 landers. We look at the most advanced, daring explorations of our modern age, crossing the ultimate horizon of space, and we instinctively reach back 1,000 years to name it after the Norse, because the longship is the universal symbol of the crosser of horizons.
Which naturally brings us to a deeper psychological question. Why do they still grip us so tightly? As you said, we name our most advanced spacecrafts after them. We make massive hit TV shows about them. Their mythology saturates our comic books and movies. There are many fierce peoples in history. There are many brilliant conquerors, many terrifying raiders, many empires that rose and fell. The Mongols, the Huns, the Romans. Why the Vikings? Why are we and why are you, the listener, drawn to this specific culture so much so that you've spent hours upon hours journeying with us through their world?
I think it operates on a few different levels. First, there is the undeniable psychological appeal of untamed freedom. Let's be brutally honest about our lives today. We live in a highly regulated, very comfortable, deeply digitized, tame, modern world. Our biggest daily challenge might be a Wi-Fi outage, a Zoom call that goes too long, or a traffic jam on the commute home. We are bound by endless rules and social contracts.
Right.
The Viking represents something wildly intoxicatingly different. They represent a fierce, unapologetic, fearless self-reliance. It is the romance of the adventurer who points a ship at the horizon, answers to absolutely no one but their gods and their own courage, and just goes. In our cubicle-bound, heavily scheduled lives, the idea of standing on the prow of a ship, feeling the freezing salt spray on your face, master of your own destiny, untethered from society's rules, it is incredibly seductive.
There is absolutely a deep wish fulfillment there, a sort of primal escapism. But I would argue there is also a profound philosophical resonance that goes far deeper than just the romance of rebellion. If we bring it all the way back to season 1, when we deeply explored their worldview and their mythology, Why does Norse mythology endure? Why do we still fundamentally care about Thor and Loki and Odin?
Because it's not a fairy tale where the good guys are guaranteed to win.
Exactly. It is deeply, profoundly moving because it is entirely fatalistic. The Norse mythology isn't about omnipotent gods who are invincible and live happily ever after in a flawless paradise. It is about doomed gods. Odin knows with absolute certainty that Ragnarok is coming. He knows that the great wolf Fenrir will eventually break his chains. He knows that the world will burn, the oceans will boil, and he knows that he and the other gods will die fighting it. They cannot stop the apocalypse.
That is such a heavy burden to carry.
But here's the beauty of it. Knowing they will lose, they fight anyway. It is about facing absolute certain destruction with unflinching courage. And I think on a subconscious level, that speaks directly to our own modern anxieties. We all face mortality. We all face a world that often feels chaotic, overwhelming, and sometimes doomed. The Norse myths teach us a very hard, very beautiful lesson. Finding meaning isn't about winning forever. It's about defiance. It's about how you choose to stand in the face of the storm, even when you know the storm will eventually take you.
That gives me chills, honestly. The bravery of knowing you'll lose but fighting anyway.
Yeah.
It's a philosophy of beautiful defiance. But let me push you on this, because I think there's a simpler, more visceral reason they still grip us. And it ties back to the DNA we talked about earlier.
The ancestral echo.
Yes. For millions of people listening to this series, this isn't just an interesting abstract period of medieval history. It is literally their family tree. We are drawn to them because, in a very real biological and linguistic sense, we are looking at ourselves 1,000 years ago. When we read the sagas, when we look at the worn handles of the artifacts, we are looking at the hands of our ancestors. The pull of the Viking is the pull of our own deep roots. It's the ultimate origin story for a massive portion of the modern world.
Which brings us to the final climactic question of this entire saga, the question we promised to answer. So what does this all mean? We've traced the raids, the trade routes, the settlements, the DNA, the words, the philosophy. We are at the end of the road. Let's ask it. Who actually won?
Right. And if you just look at the surface of history, if you just read a textbook timeline, it looks like a massive, definitive defeat for the Vikings.
It really does.
The Viking Age definitively ends. The longships eventually stop coming. The old, fierce pagan gods, Thor and Odin, slowly fall to the shadow of the cross as Scandinavia completely Christianizes. And then you have the ultimate punctuation mark in the year 1066. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge, Harald Hardrada, the terrifying, larger-than-life last great Viking king, takes an Anglo-Saxon arrow to the throat and dies on English soil. His legendary army is completely shattered. It looks like game over. The monks who cowered in terror at Lindisfarne seemingly outlasted the raiders. The settled Christian feudal kingdoms won. The Viking way of life was extinguished.
But this is where the mechanics of history get incredibly beautiful and incredibly complex, because if we connect this to the bigger picture, if we really look at the grand sociological pattern of everything we've discussed over these 28 sessions, that narrative of defeat completely flips. The Vikings didn't lose, they won. But they achieved a beautiful, mind-bending paradox. They achieved victory by absorption.
Wait, I have to push back on that, because if your culture is erased, your language is heavily diluted, your old religion is entirely replaced by Christianity, and your independent kingdoms are swallowed up. How is that a victory? That doesn't sound like winning. That sounds like getting swallowed whole. That sounds like standard imperial defeat.
It sounds like it until you look at who is doing the swallowing and what the society looks like afterward. Let's trace the unifying thread across all our previous seasons. Look at what happened everywhere the Vikings went in sufficient numbers. They didn't operate like the British Empire in India, ruling as a tiny, aloof, segregated upper class that eventually gets expelled. They integrated.
Right, they really dug in.
Let's look at the mechanics of it. Rollo's fearsome Viking warriors in France realized that to hold the land permanently, they needed to adapt. So they adopted the French language, they converted to the French religion, they mastered French cavalry tactics, and they intermarried with the French nobility. They became the Normans. And as the Normans, they went on to conquer England, southern Italy, and Sicily.
Which is an insane legacy on its own.
Exactly. Look at the Swedish Rus. They sailed down the rivers of Eastern Europe, but they didn't stay isolated in their river forts. The political and economic incentives demanded integration. They intermarried with the massive local Slavic populations, adopting their customs, their clothing, and eventually their language, and they became the foundational rulers of the Russians and Ukrainians.
And the Irish connection.
The Norse, who built the massive fortress ports in Ireland, intermarried with the Gaelic lords to secure political alliances. They became the Hiberno-Norse, essentially becoming a new breed of Irishman.
And England.
The Danes, who settled the vast territory of the Danelaw in England, lived beside the Anglo-Saxons, traded with them, married them, fused their languages together, and eventually they simply became the English. And the Vikings, who sailed to the absolute edge of the habitable world in Iceland, they became the Icelanders.
Oh, man. When you lay it out like that, it clicks. It's the ultimate realization of this entire series. Think about this. The descendants of the terrified, defenseless monks who were slaughtered on the beach at Lindisfarne in 793, and the descendants of the axe-wielding raiders who killed them. If you trace their family lines down through the centuries, through the intermarrying and the assimilation, they eventually merge. They are now the exact same people.
Precisely. It's like a dominant genetic trait. They didn't conquer the world in the way the Romans did, holding it down with military garrisons and walls until the empire eventually collapsed under its own weight. And the world didn't destroy them. They flowed together, like two massive rivers joining into one unstoppable stream. The true victory of the Vikings wasn't building a static empire that lasted 1,000 years. Their victory was becoming the foundational fabric of the modern world. They didn't defeat the populations they encountered, they infused them. They won by becoming us.
That is profound. They won by becoming us. As we finally close this out, I want you, the listener, to picture two distinct scenes in your mind. I want these two images to bracket this whole immense journey we've been on together. Scene 1. It is the year 793. The gray, choppy sea off the coast of Lindisfarne. A monk looks out from the monastery and sees the square sail and the carved dragon prow cutting through the morning mist. It is the arrival of the alien, the terror, the great violent disruption of the age.
A truly terrifying moment in time.
Now hold that image and fast forward 3 centuries to scene 2. It's a sunny afternoon in the Danelaw, somewhere in the rolling hills of Yorkshire. An ordinary English family is farming their land peacefully. The grandfather is leaning on a fence, speaking a heavily Norse-flavored dialect to his grandson. They are Christians. They are locals. They belong to the land. The terrifying enemy from the sea simply became the ancestor in the soil. That is the whole magnificent arc of the Viking Age.
And as we take a moment to reflect on that arc, I want to consciously shift the spotlight just slightly as we say goodbye. Throughout this series, we have naturally focused on the famous figures. We had to. We've talked endlessly about the Ragnars, the Haralds, the Ivars, the kings, the queens, and the conquerors. But the true legacy, the deep, enduring inheritance we've been talking about today, was actually carried by the forgotten majority.
The normal people.
Yes, it wasn't just the kings who changed the world. It was the ordinary people. It was the comb makers in the muddy streets of Jorvik, meticulously shaping bone. It was the mothers raising children in a new, unfamiliar, and often hostile land in the Danelaw. It was the farmers working the harsh, unforgiving, volcanic soil of Iceland just to survive the winter. It was the traders haggling over the price of amber in the bustling markets of Dublin. The kings got the epic sagas written about them, yes, but the ordinary people, the ones whose names are lost to history, they got the future. Their blood, their labor, and their words are the ones that survived to build the modern world.
The ordinary Vikings built the foundations we stand on. Now, a quick warning for you. This episode is the grand finale of our main saga. We have answered the big questions, we have tallied the legacy, but there is one last special epilogue still to come. We simply couldn't leave you without telling one final, quiet, deeply haunting coda to this whole era.
It's perhaps the most fascinating, chilling mystery of all.
Next time, I invite you to stay with us for the story of Greenland. We're going to look at the colony pushed to the absolute ragged edge of the known world. A society that clung on against the advancing ice, the crushing isolation in the dark for nearly 500 years, and then simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but empty stone churches, frozen graves, and absolute silence. It is a profound story, and you won't want to miss it. But for now, for the main journey of the Norsemen, we have finally reached the end of the road. Thank you deeply for taking this massive journey with us, for giving us your time, your curiosity, your critical thinking, and your imagination across 28 deep dives. We hope you walk away seeing the Vikings not as simple caricatures, not as cartoon villains or flawless heroes, but as the incredibly complex, brilliant, terrifying, and awe-inspiring humans they truly were. So, I will raise a glass to you and offer a final, heartfelt Skál. Wishing you safe travels and calm seas wherever your own saga takes you next.